Hello and welcome to Crushing Comics. I'm your host Peter, and we are here one last time to fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. It's not really going to be the last time because there's going to be more. There's going to be more videos. There's going to be more ongoing series. I've really enjoyed doing this. It's something I've always wanted to do, and it's funny. I originally wanted to really be on stage and in front of things, and I started off by being in plays and doing theater. You heard the origin story of that a few episodes ago, and then I became a musician and I was on stage a lot through that, and I did acting and all of that, but I've never really had the chance to be like me on camera. I used to be obsessed with reality shows, like The Real World and Road Rules especially, back in the very early days of reality shows. And I just wanted to be on Road Rules so damn bad. I just wanted to live in that damn Winnebago. And as time went on and reality shows changed, I cared less about that sort of thing. But I think when I started my blog, Crushing Crisis, back in 2000, that was my version of being on a reality show. And I always loved the people at that time who had web pages where they would broadcast everything they did, either by writing a diary entry every day, or even people in the early days of video, which video was always so threatening to me, that kind of documented their whole life. And I always thought, gosh, I would do that. I would record my whole life and just be a constant channel. And I think that my adventures and my inanity is interesting enough that I could be a channel. I was a college student, I was in theater, I was a musician, I had dating drama, all of this stuff. Now, I think a camera following me around maybe would be a lot less interesting. I'm married, I have a kid, I talk a lot about buying houses and saving money, but I did move here to Wellington, New Zealand, so I suppose I'm a little bit interesting, right? How many people tear up their whole comic collection, uproot it from Philadelphia and move to Wellington? So who knows? But this show and this channel has become my first time that I've ever been performing as me, and not just through songs, but just me. On video. Of course, I've been doing it on my blog for 17 years, and it's been a whole lot of fun, and I really appreciate everybody who's been watching it all along, and there's a lot more to come. So let's see what this last book is. Have you figured it out? I mean, it's not like I made it super obscure. It is. Okay, and there's a little bonus book in here, too, because there's always a surprise here on Crushing Comics. It is Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. And with it is this little extra bonus point, X4, which is that Astonishing X-Men team crossing over with Fantastic Four, written by Akira Yoshida, who's not a real person. He's actually Marvel's new editor-in-chief, C.B. Cebulski, under a pen name. And we're not going to talk about that any further. Let's just talk about this. So, Astonishing X-Men began in 2004, and it was the outgrowth of Grant Morrison's new X-Men. So Grant Morrison did all these things with the team. He had kind of established this new small team that in that book was Cyclops and Jean, Wolverine and Beast, Emma, and that's it, right? That was pretty much it. I mean, and a whole lot of other characters kind of flowing around and through, but that was the core of it. So Jean, no longer available, and Morrison actually wanted to use Colossus, and only to find out that he was dead and wasn't going to be brought back anytime soon. So he had Emma have Diamond form, and that was the way that he had a heavy on his team, right? So Morrison's run ends, and Marvel suddenly is without this marquee X-Men book. And so they bring Claremont back for a new age. They have a lot of other things happening, but they're like, how can we maintain that energy, that excitement that we had of Morrison writing X-Men every month? And they stage a major coup within a year of Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer ending on television. Marvel manages to snag him to write an ongoing, in continuity X-Men comic book, which they call Astonishing X-Men. There had been Astonishing X-Men twice in the past. It was one of the titles of one of the Age of Apocalypse series, and it also was a brief mini-series in Apocalypse the 12 crossover. But this is the first time it was going to be an ongoing series. And Whedon basically continues right from Morrison, but he realizes that they need to make some tweaks to the team. So the first thing he does is he has Kitty come back to the school. And like, she had kind of been really developed by Chris Claremont in Extreme X-Men, where we see her at college and she's kind of like an adult. Because Chris Claremont has never been one to be afraid of having the characters get older, right? But Whedon kind of de-ages her a little bit here. He never comes right out and says she's younger, but he just plays her a little bit younger than she had been. Although she's, I think, in Whedon's conception, it seems to be she's like maybe like 18 or 19, when maybe Claremont had thought that she had aged up a little. Who knows? It's always best when comics don't make explicit references to these things on the page. But he brings her back under an interesting auspice, which is that Emma Frost now is kind of de facto co-in charge of the X-Men Academy along with Cyclops. It's not the first time, right? She had been in charge of the X-Men Academy all through Generation X and really hadn't appeared too many places between Generation X and when Morrison picks her up, because Generation X ends and then shortly thereafter she's on Genosha and Morrison blows up Genosha and then he's on her team. But Emma Frost wants Kitty there as like a check on her. She realizes that she's gone from the outsider who isn't trusted, which is what she had always been in Generation X and also was in Morrison's new X-Men, to being part of the inner circle because of her relationship with Cyclops and because Jean is no longer there. So this is Emma being in charge not of a satellite, not the Massachusetts school, but being in charge of the actual Xavier dream. And Emma feels like, what if I'm not up to that? What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not making the right decisions? What if I have too much self-interest? And so she's the one who asks Kitty back. Of course, if you know your Kitty Pryde history, Kitty Pryde debuts along with Emma Frost back in the 129, I guess, of Uncanny X-Men. And her first experience with being a mutant and the X-Men is Emma being unbearably cruel to the team and taking them captive and fighting with them. And so that's what Kitty's reality is of an X-Men. And so she kind of comes back and she's like, really, you expect me to call a truce with you of everybody? I'm fine with you being the headmistress, but don't pretend like we're going to be friends now. And Emma didn't mean for them to be friends. She needed somebody who had exactly those feelings about her. So there's a lot of tension. There's the Kitty and Emma tension. There's the tension of Jean being gone and Scott seemingly moving on with Emma, which Beast and Wolverine just cannot deal with. And there's Kitty's tension of being back at the school without Colossus, who had been her great love and who died to rid the school of the legacy virus. So Whedon is playing with all of these themes that are there, but he's also adding a totally new thing in this first arc. He doesn't just play with the existing themes, he invents new characters and a new conflict in a way that's really, really thrilling. And the issue that I first picked up, I had to have been in 2005, and I can't think of what context I bought it in. I know I was on a car trip with my wife. I know we had just stopped into a bookstore, and I can't tell you why. Like, why were we stopping in bookstores in 2005, and like, what long car trip were we taking that I decided I needed a book? I can't remember the context there. But I do remember just having to walk through the store, and I was totally not keeping up with X-Men in the slightest at this point, like not even reading on Wikipedia. And seeing that cover, that John Cassaday cover of Wolverine upside down, diving at me. And just kind of like browsing the spinner rack and looking, and saying, wait a second, Joss Whedon? This is X-Men by Joss Whedon? I had no idea it was happening. I was not tuned into that stuff at the time. I was busy like songwriting and playing City of Heroes, I think, at that point. So I bought it to read in the car, and it's an amazing, amazing issue. It's funny. It has Kitty, who's one of my all-time favorite X-Men characters. Apparently they're trying to find a cure for being a mutant. This is before House of M. But also there's this crazy alien who has some opinions about the X-Men. There's Nick Fury in a helicarrier in a page that is just beautiful. I've never seen anything like just John Cassaday's art here. And it ends with Beast realizing that they're experimenting on a certain mutant's DNA in order to bring back, or in order to create this cure for being mutants. And everybody's immediately jumps to, is it Jean? And I don't even think I knew that Jean was dead, so I was like, oh my gosh. And it has everything. It has Wolverine and Beast having this throwdown. It has Beast as Cat Beast. It has, them having a timeout in the Danger Room and this good Emma Frost. I didn't understand why she was with Scott. I was like, I don't get it. But I was fascinated. So I kind of forgot about it a little bit. I had that one individual comic. And then later I walked into Tower Records in Philadelphia on the great flagship store that was on Broad and Chestnut. And in the spinner rack was the trade paperback of the first collection. I was like, yes, I will buy that for $15. And I took it home and read it, and it was every bit as good as this one issue suggested. And so I started keeping up with it. It was the only comic that I was keeping up with at all. And of course, coming out at a glacial pace, because, Cassaday draws slowly and Whedon is, involved in a lot of other things. And I just kept buying the trade paperbacks as they came out. And before this kind of legendary story that I always tell about 2010 and having our house and buying all these comics, before any of that happened, I had this set of 4 Astonishing X-Men on my shelf, and it's so self-contained, it rewards itself so much that there's nowhere that it goes to after it. It just ends. It ends in a really definitive way so that you don't have to read anything else after it. It does refer to some other things. In fact, the second arc really, and the third arc, both have strong references to what went down in Morrison's X-Men, and it's a little confusing if you've read Morrison's X-Men because Whedon makes some mistakes that editorial, for whatever reason, didn't fix, and it makes things a little bit confusing. Partially mistakes related to Cassandra Nova. And it's never, I think eventually it gets retconned and fixed by somebody in the future, but if all you read is New X-Men and then you read this, you would be right to be confused because there are just some editorial things that don't quite line up. I had never read New X-Men at that point, but so I just thought, hey, this is interesting. And Whedon writes it with his, trademark Buffy snark, and in fact, Buffy was in large part inspired by Kitty Pryde. Whedon, just like the rest of us, had been reading Uncanny X-Men, although he was a second generation, actually I think third generation TV writer, so he probably had a little bit more of a destiny in that field than any of the rest of us did. But he had been reading X-Men in the 80s and he loved Kitty Pryde, and part of that experience of Kitty Pryde as the point of view character, but also a superhero and also a real girl, was part of what inspired Buffy, and he said that on many occasions. So this was like him getting to write his favorite thing. Of course he's going to bring Kitty Pryde in. But he also writes an outstanding Emma. He really establishes the Emma voice that would be continued. And he really establishes the in-charge Scott Summers. He's very unsure of himself at different points of New X-Men. And Morrison, he wrote a good Cyclops, but Morrison was way more interested in Jean, I think, of the two of them. And so Whedon establishes this Cyclops, this very decisive Cyclops. He's always been decisive in the field, but this is a Cyclops who's decisive as a leader of more than just the X-Men. And that gets continued into Messiah Complex, into Second Coming, into Avengers vs. X-Men, and ultimately into Brian Bendis. And this ends with a heartbreaking change of events. It has some really rewarding changes at the beginning of it. A character comes back who we haven't seen for a while, which I'm sure you know, but I'm not going to say it. And it ends with sending a character away, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I cried the way I did in the Dark Angel saga, but it was like a shot through the heart the way that it ends. And that gets resolved in Nation X, which we talked about a few episodes ago. Nation X, after, a few years after this has ended, kind of epilogues that and brings some resolve into that. So in terms of recommending X-Men to somebody who's new to X-Men, I always will say this. It's readily available. Marvel understands it's a big hit. They keep it evergreen in paperback, so it's always available. And it's great because it's self-contained. The characters have very followable voices. It's all by one writer and a single artist, which is pretty impressive for a 25-issue series, because it's 24 issues plus a giant-size issue to wrap it up. Of course, that's why it came out so slowly, and at the same time, John Cassaday was also drawing Planetary, which we've opened in the past, with Warren Ellis, so he had his plate full. And Cassaday, after this, he's never quite as good ever again, after this in Planetary. I was so excited when Uncanny Avengers came out in Marvel Now, and Cassaday just he wasn't the same. And I've just never seen him look as good as he looked here. So this is an amazing comic book. It brought back my awareness that comics were even a thing, which then in turn allowed me to be tuned into video games, which then made me tuned into the Civil War being a thing, which then made me pick up the Civil War trade paperback, and ultimately led me to all of this. So curses, Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. But, I think that's where we are right now with what comic books are. You can be a fan of the comic book characters in so many other mediums, cartoons, video games, movies, and have never read a comic book. And the audiences for these things are huge. If you look at the movie's gross, and the movie grossed, let's just say 200 million, which is on the low side for comic book movies. You know, if tickets are $10, that means that 20 million tickets got sold. Now, some people might go repeatedly, some of those tickets might have been $15, so let's half that again. But that means 10 million people potentially saw that movie. That's the way math works. And the highest selling comic book in print in any given month at this point never really breaks 100,000 copies. Now, of course, that doesn't take into account digital, and that doesn't take into account people pirating those comics, and that doesn't take into account people who are reading them later in trade paperback or in omnibus format. So let's be generous and double that. Let's say the top selling comic gets seen by 200,000 eyeballs. It's still a fraction of the people who see those same characters in a movie, right? So that is 5 to 1, 10 to 50. It's 1/50th of the people who, the 10 million people who potentially saw the movie. And so it's important to have these things that people can come into from the outside. And I'm somebody who loves continuity as much as the next person, but you can't hand somebody this like 500-page epic. People are like, I want to read X-Men, and people recommend them. You should start with Claremont Uncanny X-Men #1. Start there. I'm like, oh my god, what are you doing? You're making that person read hundreds of issues of X-Men in a style that is antique with, old artwork and with so many years to get through, formative years of Claremont figuring out what he's doing. That person is not going to love comic books. You need comic books like this one to be able to hand to somebody who's come from the movies. Comics that look great, that have a widescreen appeal, that have characters that are witty, funny, and then you develop their love of the medium, right? Because there's 10 million people or more seeing these movies, right? Think about once they get to DVD and streaming and all the people that watch them. Hundreds of millions of people ultimately see these movies. Think about how everybody has seen a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. And they deserve to be comic fans, and we deserve to have them as fellow fans with us. But here's the other thing. Having continuity-free books doesn't help anyone either. DC's strategy is always to have these evergreen books that may or may not be in continuity. Somewhere over here on the shelf I have New Frontier, which is an amazing book by Darwin Cook and master of the form. But it doesn't lead anywhere. You read it and it's one good story, and then you put it down and there's nowhere to continue to. And I think that Marvel, wisely over the years, has avoided having so many of these pockets of introductory comics that are out of continuity. This is a masterpiece of a comic that totally fits into continuity, totally acknowledges what happens. House of M happens right in the middle of this story, and Whedon just kind of winks at it for a panel and just keeps moving. But then you can read it later with all these other books and realize it does fit around House of M. But I was none the wiser when I was reading it originally, and that's the way that it should be. And I think it's so much more powerful to have me be none the wiser that House of M happened, but to have had it happened, and to reward me later for figuring that out, than to just have this book be out of continuity totally and not having anything that connects to it, and having me be done and be like, okay, I'm done now. So I've got some opinions about that. And now that Marvel and DC are both chasing the YA market, we're seeing the opposite thing happen. DC already has DC Superhero Girls, and they have added 2 new DC imprints, which are going to be coming out this year with out-of-continuity stories. Marvel is launching a new YA line of young teen characters in a kind of academy setting that is also going to be out of continuity. And I get it, that's for kids, but I miss a point where any comic could be for a 6-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 60-year-old, a 160-year-old. I don't know that Astonishing X-Men nails that. I think it's a little bit written a little bit old for a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, but not too much, not more than Claremont. What could be written at a higher level than Claremont? So yeah, this is one of my top recommendations. Fans, I've discovered, have softened on it over the years, because they're like, Whedon wasn't that good, the story wasn't that great, it had conflicts, whatever. But that's years of hindsight talking, and even with all that hindsight talking, they still can't recommend a better encapsulated X-Men run than this one. They're either going to tell you Uncanny X-Men Volume 1, and like I said, I have my problems with that, or they're going to say New X-Men, and I just think that Morrison is a little bit much for somebody who's it's their first comic, and the art on that is wildly uneven. So if we're talking about self-contained X-Men runs, this is it, babe. I think now that people know about Deadpool more, Uncanny X-Force also qualifies. And then, of course, there's Ecstatics, too, but that is a lot different than your typical X-Men. So totally by coincidence. Like, I didn't know this was going to be the last book. I don't know if it was like the last one I wrapped, because I was like holding it and saying, oh, my precious. But it wound up being the last, and then everything got shuffled in boxes, and then they all got shuffled to go onto the shelf. But I think we've discovered a couple of times that some things kind of stuck together and wound up together all this time. And somehow this little batch of like my favorite X-Men books stuck together on this low shelf here, and they wound up being the last ones they opened. And what a perfect book to end this. So thank you so much. If you're just watching this episode, like, sorry for all this rah rah rah, but this has been something I have always wanted to do, and I'm so happy to have done it for 80 plus episodes, and it's not going to be the end of Crushing Comics on video. So thank you so much for everybody who's been watching, commenting, supporting all along, and thank you for all my fans that have been reading Crushing Crisis for years and years, some of you as many as 17 years. Loving comics is fun because you love comics too, and I'll be back with more videos, you know, every day, and they're just not going to be unwrapping, and there will be a official season 2 that's not unwrapping, but that does have a continued theme, as well as all the other things that's happening on the channel. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for reading. Thank you for commenting and caring. This has been season 1 of Crushing Comics, and here's the ceremonial shelving of Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon, John Cassaday, and let's not forget the colorist, Laura Martin, who is outstanding. Here we go. I'm Peter, and this has been Crushing Comics, and we have fallen in love with my comic book collection all over again. Thank you so much for watching.
Who I am, who I am.